Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Magnetic Masculinity Podcast, where we provide men with practical tools and strategies to bridge the gap between achievement and fulfillment so that they can live their most magnetic lives. Now, today, what I want to talk about is triggers, and it's something that I think is very valuable to walk men through that. And what I would want to discuss in this episode is one, what triggers look like. So how do we identify them? Also, what they actually are, according to you. And lastly, I also want for you to walk men through what does it look like or feel like to be trigger proof. So those are the topics that I would want to discuss in this episode. And maybe what we can start with is because some men might not be aware of what are triggers, what do they look like. So maybe you can explain first what are triggers.
Great. So this will be a fun episode. And firstly, I would like to start by reminding all of us that triggers are normal, they're natural, and they are in fact the gateways or portals to our evolution, integration, and most excellent lives. I also acknowledge they don't feel great in the moment, so it's totally normal to want to avoid them or project them or deflect them to others. But again, that's why we remember that it's mildly uncomfortable, but that's where the growth is. So over time, we can get excited about triggers. Even if somebody else triggers us, we're like, oh, how exciting. Now I know where I need to do the work to level up.
So what are triggers? So let's say a person who has never heard about it, they have no idea what they are. What do they look like? What do they feel like? How can somebody like identify them?
Yeah. Okay. So a trigger, again, nothing is a fact. So the way I'm using the word or metaphor of triggers might also be called being activated. Some people call it going unconscious, like you're no longer quote unquote in control. Some people call it, activation, trigger, quote unquote, going unconscious, being flooded or completely overwhelmed. I call it a hostile takeover. So it's when a part of us in our subconscious perceives something in our situation as a threat or a wound or an opportunity for integration, and we quote unquote get triggered, activated, go unconscious, have that hostile takeover where we're no longer in control. Sometimes we're just right in the mud, or we're so overwhelmed that we can't control what we're thinking or saying. And sometimes we can be aware of that happening. Like maybe sometimes there's different layers of it. Like sometimes I'll watch myself and go, oh, she's activated right now. Oh, what is about to come out of my mouth? No, 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 no. Don't say that, Sandy. No, 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 no. Take a few deep breaths and I'm able to talk myself through it. Occasionally, we just bang, we're unconscious or we're out of control or we're not piloting that vehicle of consciousness so quickly we can't catch it. And then a quote unquote subconscious part is taking over, and sort of our protector personalities, our coping mechanisms, our wounds, or whatever our strategies are, we either shut down or lash out or get overwhelmed or say unkind things or beat ourselves up or shame collapse. Any one of those, there are different ways that we might react to a trigger. And a trigger is a perfect indicator, again, of where we have a wound. So if we have no wound on my hand and I start touching it and there's no wound on the palm of my hand, I'm going to think it tickles. I'm going to think it's funny, or I might get mildly irritated and say, I really would prefer if you not do that. But if somebody's touching me here and I have a festering wound underneath that I'm not aware of, it's going to look more like, you hurt me. And I'm going to instantly become activated and flooded. Triggers can also be really good information about our subconscious parts. So if somebody who is very, so it can be a wound, It can be an unintegrated part or an invitation for parts work. So for instance, an example of that is if I get super triggered or activated and frustrated and unconscious and reactive could be another way it comes out. If I get really reactive because somebody else interrupts, for instance, I might have a part of me that interrupts, or I get really triggered by confident people and I'm like, they're so cocky and they just get me super going. It might be an invitation that my lack of confidence is inviting me to develop my confidence, but that I think that confidence is cockiness. So I have an old wound or a miswired software program. So all triggers, activations, or hostile takeovers or reactivities or upsets are invitations for healing. And they are also a very exciting opportunity to integrate the subconscious, bring it from the subconscious into the light of our conscious awareness, so that we're not only more integrated, but over time, we're more stress resilient and trigger proof. And it doesn't necessarily mean we will prefer everything. Like if somebody is doing something, if they're acting in a trigger, if they've got a hostile takeover going on and they're yelling at me or calling me names or trolling me on social media or whatever, it doesn't mean I love or approve of that behavior, but I'm able to stay rational, objective, maintain grace, and seek to understand it, because really everything is just information. So I'm able to look at that information. What is this trigger? This person is triggered. What information does that contain? Or I'm triggered. What information does that contain? And being accountable for our own reactions and having tools and strategies to work through them, because we're going to keep attracting the same pattern, or people are going to poke that wound over and over and over and over again. But if you heal those wounds and integrate those parts over time, doesn't mean you're going to love or approve or enjoy or prefer everything that happens, but you're going to be impervious, mostly, probably not all the time, to all of other people's behaviors and situations. And you're going to feel safer, which is going to keep you in the mindset where you can be more clear and confident of how to navigate each situation, instead of going unconscious and having one of our subconscious parts do a hostile takeover or shut down or whatever our very valid coping mechanisms are, or judging and getting super reactive to other people. Instead, we will be able to stay in curiosity, compassion, and yeah, it's just more fun, really.
So, question about that wound. What happens before we get triggered? In a sense of, is there something that is causing that trigger, and is that only external? In a sense of somebody does something, somebody says something that is triggering that trigger response. So what happens before the trigger response?
It could be anything. So yes, there is an external component, but the external component is not necessarily the cause. So it's the catalyst. It's basically our brain or our subconscious or our nervous system, the body, because we know that the brain, now we have a brain in our head, a brain in our heart, brain cells in our gut. So we could think of our whole vehicle of consciousness as one giant brain, or one, thing that reacts to other things, either consciously or subconsciously. So when something external happens and it reminds our brain, our emotions, our parts, our nervous system of something suboptimal and unhealed or unintegrated from the past, or a part of us that we have denied or rejected or disassociated from that's in the subconscious, then our body takes over and it's like, wait, you can't handle this. So we go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, whatever reaction when we're triggered, or that nervous system is activated, our vagus nerve is activated, and then we react.
So with that, let's say something external happens that triggers, and that trigger is in some ways that portal to unlock information of something that either we lack or we actually aspire to have or be. With
Mhm.
that, what would be the process or approach to actually unpack that information? So let's say somebody gets triggered, how can they actually know what's the gift in that trigger? How do they approach it?
That's a great question. And it sometimes might depend on what situation you're in and how big the trigger is. So the first thing I say is if you've gone unconscious or you've had a hostile takeover and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I really reacted to that situation. The first instinct or the instinct of the ego is to either beat ourselves up, blame ourselves, become ashamed of our behavior, or we're not willing to look at it. So we're like, they made me do that. That person made me feel this way, because we're trying to deflect accountability. So we might either lash in or lash out. All of it is perfect. And the antidote to that is celebrating the awareness. Oh, instead of beating ourselves up for what we did when we were not in awareness, it's celebrating the awareness, like we talked about in, I believe, our last episode or the episode before. It's celebrating that awareness. Oh, I'm no longer in reactivity. I observed that I had gone out of awareness into reactivity or unconscious or subconscious old behavior patterns and software that no longer serve me. That means I'm in awareness, and validate and congratulate and celebrate yourself. Because over time, that's going to rewire your brain to welcome self-awareness opportunities and not become more sensitive to those triggers, I guess.
So,
And reminding yourself that you're safe. It can also be very helpful. But then, so while you're in the moment, there's different strategies that might work. Take deep breaths. Try to practice radical compassion. If you're in a situation in a relationship, like if you're not like in the boardroom at work, you can go and you can release that trigger. You can stomp your feet up and down. You can throw something. I have clients who have a plastic baseball bat, and I'm like, don't do this forever, but give yourself like 2 minutes, 5 minutes to just unleash. Think of like a little child having a temper tantrum. They flip out, they blow up, they release all that emotion, energy and motion. They release it, they let it pass through their bodies. And then they're like, okay, let's go play. But as we tend to, again, suppress it, judge it, blame it on others, beat ourselves up instead of coming into that curiosity and celebration. So don't try to logic it. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to find the gift until you've let that energy, that emotion pass through your body. Just let it out. Don't judge it. It's just energy. It just needs to move through your body. So you can go, you can cry, you can pout, you can take deep breaths. You can tell yourself, I'm okay. You can, if you're angry, have a little temper tantrum in a safe place. If you do that by yourself in a room, or lock yourself in a bathroom, or if you have a partner that you feel safe, that can allow you to process that together, that can also be very healing, but also not probably the typical level that people are able to hold space for currently at this snapshot in evolution. And only then, after you've released it and you're sort of back in charge and you're the CEO again, you're holding the talking stick, then you can start to be really curious. And you can be curious about, was that an old wound being picked at? Was that a boundary violation? Like, was my reactivity informing me that somebody else, that something was not okay with me? Although we don't want to scapegoat that, which can happen. Or is it something that I need to claim, either one of my shadows or one of my, not that the shadows are bad, we'll do a whole thing about that. It's a part of me I have not claimed Is it an invitation for authentic alignment? Like, oh, it really triggers me and I get really activated and frustrated when people act really confident because I call them cocky and show offs or whatever, or weak, or I hate weak people or this or that, whatever triggers us. Again, it's once we've allowed that energy to release in a healthy way. And if you're in the boardroom and you notice it happening, and then you can maybe take a few deep breaths and just invite your nervous system to relax. Tell yourself, this is okay. I'm going to figure this out later. This is going to inform me of something. Because again, it doesn't mean that we're going to approve of, align with, or agree with, or prefer everything somebody else does. It just means that if we don't have a big gaping wound there, or we have a lot of clarity in that area or integration, then we're going to remain more in curiosity and discernment and compassion rather than reactivity.
So in that first step of celebrating awareness, have you seen or experienced in work with men that some of them might not find it comfortable to celebrate because they're so used to the sabotage? And what are some of the ways that maybe can help with that initial celebration instead of beating themselves up?
Yeah, or beating themselves up, or going into, I'm not bad or wrong, that person, it's that person's fault. That's sort of the two basic. There's other little flavors or nuances, but that's sort of the two basic: deflect or internalize. But they can absolutely experience that. That's a really good question. A lot of people that I work with feel very uncomfortable congratulating themselves, especially if there's emotions involved, because men have been trained and programmed or deprived in our current snapshot of society and evolution to judge, fear, or blame or scapegoat their emotions or avoid their emotions. And I would just invite them to practice celebrating in other areas of their life every day. Like, hey, I wanted to punch somebody in the face today and I didn't. I'm amazing. Good job. Or, wow, I'm really proud of myself for this or that. So it's going to feel uncomfortable, potentially. It's going to feel weird. Do it anyways, because we want to make that unfamiliar familiar. And the way through that is through the discomfort and practicing it over and over and over until that becomes our new subconscious baseline. And a lot of people are afraid to congratulate themselves because they're afraid that they will be narcissistic, or they will think they're better than others, or what have you. And I would actually propose that a healthy self-esteem, when it's balanced with accountability, not I'm better than everybody, but I'm really proud of myself. I did my best. And accepting and celebrating our awareness when we behave out of alignment is actually the antidote to those sort of things. It makes us more shame-proof, because those like sort of cocky, arrogant, overdeveloped sense of congratulating or validating oneself is actually a subconscious coping mechanism to protect or avoid the shame and insecurity and inferiority that is underneath that, and to meet our valid need as human beings for appreciation, admiration, adoration. So you either get that need met in a healthy way, or you create subconscious strategies to manipulate to get that need met. So just as you're speaking, I know that that's a common objection that I help people overcome frequently by reflecting that perspective, that it's actually the antidote. And when we're in that healthy self-esteem and we're really proud of ourselves and we celebrate ourselves, we will be more likely to project that to the external world and to look more like, it's okay if I make mistakes. I'm really proud of myself, and it's okay if you make mistakes, and I'm really proud of you. And it sort of creates this more open and more accepting way of approaching when either ourselves or somebody else is activated or unconscious and therefore not in charge of, they're upset and they're not in charge of, they're not as aware, so they're not as in charge of their reactions in that moment, which is perfectly normal and not what most of us prefer.
So with that, so first it's celebration of awareness, then they release whatever comes up. And with that, identifying the gift or the information piece, whether it's a wound or boundary violation or something like that, what is it that could help to perceive it as information in a way of kind of detaching emotion out of it, where you're actually able to look at it as and perceive it as information instead of similar to what you explained, it might trigger and then there's emotional shutdown or something like that. What can help to actually see it and perceive it as information?
Practice.
Hmm.
Intention, practice, remembering why you're doing it can be helpful. And having a healthy relationship with your emotions by not suppressing them or avoiding them, but allowing them to be there and allowing them to also inform you. So I have, it's over there, but I have a couple of different emotional scales that I give men. I'm like, here's where you are on an emotional scale. So for instance, yesterday, I experienced a trigger around playing sports and I got very activated and I could observe myself kind of going a little bit unconscious and becoming a little bit suboptimal in my behavior. And I felt hopeless and overwhelmed and sad. And then I got angry, but that's anger is a level up. And then I started to feel slightly humor. And then I started to feel hopeful. And then I started to feel, so I was able to keep my logic on board as I allowed those emotions to pass through me without blaming them on anybody else, making anybody else responsible for them, but having compassion for myself that I was going through that. And then I'm very quick at figuring out what the root cause or the root trigger is of it. So I'm able to parallel process it very quickly in the moment. I'm like, oh, I'm acting like a child right now. I'm being a brat. Oh, what is this here to teach me? Oh, now I've gone from hopelessness and apathy and drama to anger. That's wonderful because anger is a step up. It means I'm back in power. Now, how can I find a thought that helps me reach for apathy? And then how can I reach for hopefulness? Then how can I reach for contentment? How can I can move through those things very quickly, but I've had a lot of practice. And over time, when you heal those underlying wounds, or you integrate, or you eat your shit sandwiches, or you own your awesome and own your shit, over time, you're going to become more integrated, more healed, and you're going to naturally stay more in curiosity and objectivity, even if something is not what you prefer. It's just that you'll be able to stay more in a state of grace and compassion and presence.
Can you maybe walk through or explain a bit more about what you explained that you went through, where logic was on board while you were walking through emotions? Like, how does that look like? And in some ways, it might be even like transition towards like trigger proof. But how does that look like for somebody who might not even have ever thought of it as a possibility, but then also for them to be able to identify, how does that look like? How does it feel like, that process?
Well, I think that process over time becomes a consequence. And it's also sort of one of my superpowers because I've spent my whole life being curious and introspective and self-reflective. And like I always say, I've been studying human beings since I was 4 years old to survive. So I'm just naturally, this is my special interest. I never chose to have children. Bless everybody that does. Thank you for doing the most important job on the planet. But I've had a lot of time in my life. I've had decades where I've spent months alone in meditation, in silence, in introspection. So don't compare yourself to me at the beginning. And understand what I would want people to hear from that is that I occasionally, now I've gone years without being triggered or activated, and I love it. It's very empowering, but I've also had times in my life where somebody could sneeze wrong and I would be triggered or activated. So I know I've experienced both ends of that spectrum. And what it's going to look or feel like at the beginning, possibly, everybody's different. What I often see it look like is you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to be emotionally flooded, overwhelmed. You're going to either shut down, you're going to run away, you're going to lash out, whatever your reactions are. And there's also like parts work and attachment styles and trauma and a whole bunch of layers in there as well. So what it's probably going to look or feel like is bang. You're not even aware that you're out of awareness until later down the road, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 10 hours, maybe 10 days, maybe 10 months later, you're going to go, oh, wait a minute. I think I was reactive, or why was I reactive? So at the beginning, they might not happen simultaneously. And even if they never happen simultaneously, that would be okay too, as long as you have the tools and protocols and understanding and awareness and metaphors to be able to understand and utilize the gifts that are contained within those. And then over time, you might step into that awareness where most of the time, I don't become reactive to things. And when I do, I'd say 90% of the time now, I'm able to observe it happening and be like, woo, kind of like watching characters in a movie. I'm like, woo, this part of me is getting activated and that part of me is coming after it. And I'm sort of able to stay in this sort of meta cognition, higher self perspective and awareness of it. Occasionally, especially in personal, intimate relationships, occasionally I go right into reactivity, but I have the tools to move through it. And again, I understand the gifts and integration that are contained within it.
So I think this is one important piece to touch on. Let's say it's 10 months later. The person identifies that they were triggered, or they reacted in not the best way. How to approach that, or how to move towards maybe making that gap smaller until it might get into this moment. The reason why I'm asking is because a lot of times, even looking back, that in itself can be triggering, because they might identify, they might feel shame or guilt or some negative emotion about the way they were behaving, or they might now start to get into self-sabotage. What could be some helpful ways to approach it when it has happened? We reacted the way we didn't want to react. We behaved not in the best ways. How to deal with it when you step in that awareness, you're able to see it, but it has happened.
Yeah. Well, so some of the tools we've gone through in previous episodes could be helpful. Radical compassion would be very helpful. So acknowledging that, this is not me. This is not my fault. This is a subconscious program that I'm reacting to, and I deserve to be, seen and heard and healed. It was a cry for help. And it's not anybody's fault for creating that in me. And I might have impacted others with my unskillfulness, but we all deserve compassion. So those that impacted me, myself that was impacted, and those that I impacted with my subconscious stuff. So radical compassion could be a good first one, and celebrating the awareness. Whoa, I was out of awareness. Now I'm in awareness. That's progress. So rather than beating ourselves up for what we did when we didn't know better, remember that you were quite literally subconscious. You weren't aware, you weren't in charge, but that doesn't mean that you didn't impact people. But it's not as helpful to guilt and shame collapse as it is to own it, step into that radical compassion, and then figure out what it is there to teach you. And over time, you'll notice that the frequency, duration, and intensity will, be a net positive. And you won't get it perfect right away. And you will go unconscious or activated or triggered or reactive or flooded. And that's okay. But and if you're in a personal relationship, you can have really sort of healthy protocols to work through these things together. At work, you're probably going to have to work through it alone a little more. But again, having those tools and having that baseline foundation of self-compassion and radical compassion is very helpful. And understanding that these triggers or reactivities or reactions are the portals or gateways to the next level of our evolution, and how we level up in this game called life can be very helpful. and practicing that compassion. So even if you notice yourself beating yourself up or going, yeah, but it's their fault, just accept whatever is where it is and try to lean into curiosity.
Okay. And
because it actually can be I used to, then I'd shame collapse and I'd beat myself up, be like, how could you do that? Which was actually, when I reflected one day sitting in a hammock, I'm like, that's actually really self-centered. Because then I'm spending more time and more energy beating myself up and feeling bad and trying to find somebody else's cause for it, rather than just looking at it, having compassion for myself, compassion for the other people that might have been reactive. All of us were unconscious. We're fairly traumatized species. We're trying to heal out of the emotional dark ages. So again, rather than beat myself up for what I did when I didn't know better, I looked at, oh, but now I know better. That doesn't mean I was a failure. It means I'm growing. That's the whole point. I'm nailing it.
And touching on being trigger proof.
Yeah.
What does that look like or feel like to be trigger proof?
Well, first of all, when I say trigger proof, I should say more trigger proof or more trigger resilient. And that does take time. And I don't know how much time because every person's different. So don't have any expectations of yourself. Just show up and say, today I want to be aware of anything that I need to be aware of in order to integrate, grow, evolve, become more self-aware, integrate my blind spots, heal my wounds, because I'm an evolutionary boss and I can. So you set that intention, you practice that radical compassion. And then, sorry, what was the question? Say it again.
What does that look like? What does it feel like? Because
oh, trigger proof, right?
Yeah, being trigger proof.
And then over time, you'll just notice that you're able to stay in that state of grace or compassion or curiosity or discernment more often. And it means that you're becoming less self-centered and more aware and curious about what's happening around you. Oh, this person in my reality is clearly activated, triggered, unconscious. So I know that they're not in charge. They are not piloting their vehicle of consciousness right now. There has been a hostile takeover. I've been in a hostile takeover. I don't prefer it, but I can own that in myself. So therefore, when I recognize it in somebody else, instead of being like, why are they behaving that way? And it triggering my triggers, I'm more like, oh, okay, I wonder if I can be that anchor for them while they're triggered or activated because it's a cry for help. And that doesn't mean that you will never get triggered. I rarely get triggered, but I had one area of my life that I avoided for many years doing deep work in. And that is the area of my life where I can now get triggered, even though I did not get triggered for some years. Or very rarely, or if I do, I move through the trigger in maybe 3 minutes, whereas before it would take me 3 months of precipitating and stressing and dwelling and wallowing and resenting or shame collapsing or whatever it is. Now it's like, oh, I can process it through it very quickly, and it doesn't happen very often, which is very empowering. It means I'm upset less often. It means that other people feel safe to emote or react in front of me. I can help people get to the root of things very quickly. And it means I'm just like happier and in my flow more often because my happiness is not as determined on what other people do. And when I do get triggered now, I actually get kind of, once I let the emotion pass, I get excited because I'm like, oh, and I say, what weakness is this here to guide me to strength? And not from a place of I'm weak, I'm bad, I have to do better, but more from a place of, oh, look at this, I'm going to level up. How exciting. Now I know where to do the work. You know, if you're running a company and you want to make the company better, you're not looking at the company saying this company is garbage. There's this thing wrong with it and that thing wrong with it. You look at that company like, okay, this company has gone from 2 to 6. Now, can we improve the accounting department? Do we need a better C-suite fit? Is there, you're always looking at how to make it better, but not from a place of it's not good enough, but from falling in love with transformation, expansion, and change. But when we're shame collapsing, guilt projecting, triggered, reactive, unconscious, wounded, then we're not in I don't even like to use the word control for that. We're not in power. We're not in charge. We're just letting our little subconscious parts do those hostile takeovers. And all of a sudden we're strapped in the back seat of our vehicle of consciousness getting driven down a bumpy road to nowhere town. And it's just not as much fun, quite frankly.
So with this, as you were talking, I was thinking about to ask about how does the perception of triggers change over time as you practice it more and more?
Well, sometimes I notice things that I'm like, oh, at one point in my life, that would have really triggered me. And now it just sort of feels neutral. Let me give you a story that I share. And I would like to acknowledge that the flavor of this story is slightly distasteful. And I did it with intention, conscious intention, because I knew it would be effective. Bear with me. So I worked with an amazing gal once who was Indigenous. And I very much knew what her trauma was, and it was very valid trauma. And she's actually now to this day one of my closest friends and probably one of my top 3 favorite human beings, top 5 favorite human beings. So I don't leave anybody I love out. And at this time, I was trying to explain triggers to her. And she wasn't quite getting it because she was currently on a journey of overcoming anger and reactivity and sort of aggression and resentment. And that's what she had come to me to work through. And she ended up actually working for me because this worked so well for her. So believe you me, this stuff works. And we could talk testimonials all day long of people who are like, I just feel so much better. But what I said to her was, she's like this really beautiful, strong, ex-professional rugby player, Indigenous goddess woman, super just amazing. But I said to her, how would you feel if I called you a dumb blonde? And she was like, I don't know. I don't think that's a very nice thing to say, but I would feel, she's like, almost, to be honest, we were very real with each other. She's like, honestly, a part of me feels like a little bit flattered or like a little bit cute about that, or, but I would also think that that's not a nice thing to say to someone. And I said, okay, but you're able to observe that and logic through that. Do you become unconscious, reactive, and like you want to punch me? And she's like, absolutely not. And I said, well, how do you think I'd feel if you called me a dumb blonde? She's like, I don't know, the same. And I said, well, I actually wouldn't feel anything right now. But at a point in my life, I had so much shame and confusion about being intellectually gifted, but having long blonde hair and people not taking me seriously, or in business, men thinking I was a certain way, women making certain judgments about me, not thinking that I was intelligent, not listening to me, physically violating me because they thought I was a certain way because of how I looked. So at one point in my life, that would have triggered me because I had a lot of wounds around that. I had a lot of boundaries around that, and I'd experienced a lot of trauma and I had a lot of shame and confusion around that. So at one point in my life, if you called me that, I would have either lashed out at you or believed you and like shame collapsed and gone into self-deprecating behavior. But now if you said that to me, I would just think it's not a super nice thing to say to somebody, or I would probably be curious. Actually, at this point in my evolution, I'd be curious. I'd be like, tell me about your association with that. Like, where did that programming come from? How have you experienced that? I'd be curious about it. But one point in my life, that would have crumbled me. And then I said to her, what if I called you a dirty Indian? And she lunged at me across the room, and her heart rate went up, her face was hot, and she felt like she physically wanted to punch me. And of course, I would like to acknowledge that is a horrible thing to say to somebody. And I knew that that was something that had been said to her in childhood, which is why I said it. I do not approve of it. I do not condone it. That is not how I feel. I just want to be really crystal clear about that. But I knew that it would very quickly and effectively teach her about triggers. Now I said, how do you think I would feel if somebody said I was dirty? So maybe somebody wouldn't even have to be that direct. I was just using a very, very obvious, obtuse thing in order to create this understanding and alignment. So it wouldn't have to be that subtle. It could be something as like somebody sniffing around her, like something smells bad, and she could think dirty because she has that, or somebody saying, oh, whatever it is. It could still trigger that wound, but I wanted to just be really obvious for this example. And I said, how do you think I would feel if you called that derogatory term to me? I would be slightly confused by it. I would think, this person clearly has a lot of wounding and separation around accepting and loving different cultures and different parts of us, because everybody is a part of us. I wonder who taught them that. I don't prefer that. That doesn't align with how I feel about our indigenous souls on the planet, but I wouldn't have that deep loathing, hatred, anger, reactivity, unconscious response. I would be like, I would be in curiosity and discernment rather than feeling traumatized, angry. I would just be like, ooh, that's not great. Does that make sense?
So
Is that helpful?
what I wrote down is that pretty much it could be that you can go from taking it personally to being more curious about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it just means there's not a wound there. So like with the dumb or the dumb blonde thing, somebody could say that to me now and I'd be like, okay, that's just not true. Right. If we don't believe it, it's not true. I'm like, I'm literally not a dumb blonde. I'm really intelligent and I'm really good at making mistakes. And some things I'm really terrible at. And none of that means I'm dumb. So for me, there's just no wound there. So it wouldn't bother me. I would maybe not prefer it. I would still have discernment, but it wouldn't affect me. So over time, what other people do and say is more just evidence and information of their subconscious wounds, of their hostile takeovers. And I'm able to stay neutral or even compassionate and curious, which means my life is just easier and more fun. And when I do get triggered or activated, then I'm like, oh, great. Now I know exactly and specifically what I should be working on right now. And I genuinely see it as an opportunity for growth, expansion, and leveling up and integration. But at the beginning, I had to white knuckle it through every one. So it's over time and intention and curiosity and compassion and probably a whole bunch of failures. You're going to fail, and that's okay.
Yeah. Is there something else you would want to add as we close up? Maybe one thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking, are there some reflective questions or prompts that men can go through afterwards they have identified that they have been triggered? The moment they are in that awareness, is there something that they can do to maybe help them to unlock that hidden information in that trigger?
Yeah. So I have different emotional tools and processes that I share with clients and that I teach clients and that I practice with them so that over time they can be very autonomous with it or even practice with their intimate partners or their partners at work. But we could share, I do have a trigger protocol that's sort of like a basic somewhere to start that we could share with our audience. So you could maybe put a link down below or they could email us or whatever you think is appropriate because you're really great at those things and I'm really terrible at those things. And we could share a starting point for them.
All right.
We will sort and listening to the other episodes on radical compassion and parts work would be very helpful as well, because those are sort of the order that we do these podcasts in is very specific for a reason. Because if we have that baseline of radical compassion, self-compassion, we're less likely to become self-centered and shame collapse and go unconscious. And understanding how our parts work gives us the skills and tools to be curious about, why does one part of me feel this way? Why did that part do a hostile takeover? What are its authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values? And then going through one by one, was it an old wound being picked at? Is it a valid preference? Is it an opportunity to either eat a shit sandwich like, oh, I get so triggered when other people are bullies. Well, maybe you're a bully, but it's not your fault you're a bully, but it is your problem. And it's going to be very helpful to overcome it. Or maybe you get really triggered when people are excellent because you haven't owned your excellence yet. So it can be an opportunity to either own our awesome or own our shit without making either of them mean anything. And all the while celebrating our integration and evolutionary excellence.
I love that. Any final words? Anything else you want to add to this really value-packed episode?
I hope it's helpful for people. I would really invite anybody to ask questions, to challenge me. I'm sure there's lots of perspectives that we didn't add in this one episode because we only have 45 minutes to an hour. So this is just scratching the surface. And I would also invite people to be aware that they might be very resistant to it. The ego can be very, and again, bless our ego, love our ego. It's okay. That's a part of us too. It's never about judging parts of ourselves. It's about being curious and compassionate. So just be aware that it might feel very uncomfortable. It might feel unfamiliar, and old patterns are going to come up, and you're just going to make a conscious choice to do it differently over and over and over until that becomes your new subconscious baseline. You can reprogram your subconscious. Repetition is helpful. And whatever the journey looks like is not your problem. You can't fail as long as you keep trying.
Yeah.
And over time, focus on the frequency, duration, and intensity of the triggers and the periods we go unconscious so that you can celebrate the progress rather than beat ourselves up for the absence of perfection.
Yeah, I love that. And if you have any questions, there'll be link in show notes where you can ask questions. You can also book a free strategy session with Sandy. All the details, everything will be in the show notes. So go check it out. I would highly encourage booking a call with Sandy because that in itself can be life-changing, speaking from experience. And we will see you in the next episode.